Arts Gaming, and welcome to my short commentary on build design. So basically, I wanted to cover most of the main aspects of build design. To start off, I wanted to talk about resistance, sustain, and damage. If your build is focused solely on one of them, it probably is a flaw in your build design. I don't believe you should design your build to do specifically one thing. That's the biggest issue that most people have when it comes to build design. If you build only for physical resistance and not for damage, and rely solely on your max pools for damage, it is not going to work in most situations. You could have 40k physical resistance and it won't help you in trying to survive. Because if you're only focusing on just physical resistance, you're missing the other aspects. And let me explain. If you're only focusing on physical resistance, you could have up to 40k physical resistance, but remember there's a cap at 33,200 or around that number. And it's only going to mitigate about 48% of any type of damage. The most damage you can mitigate is 80% in conjunction with major protection, minor protection, physical, and spell resistance, and maybe some other mitigations that exist in the game that I can't think of right now. But at the same time, you have to understand that that can be debuffed through major and minor fracture, major and minor breach, major and minor defile, which will sap your health and your healing and healing recovery, or your health recovery. I'm sorry. There's lightning that does minor vulnerability, which is 8% increased damage taken to the target. There's fire damage, which is pretty much akin to oblivion damage. It's literally right under the amount of damage that oblivion damage can do to a person. And then there's oblivion damage, which ignores all mitigation, which is literally says ignores all mitigation. So no minor, no major protection, no physical resistance will save you. And then there's also bleeds. You have to take into account that bleeds ignore physical resistance and scale off of weapon damage. That's why so many builds that run dual wield or any axe build are extremely popular right now, because there's a somewhat tank meta, kind of. But at the same time, dual wield builds are extremely fun, and you really shouldn't harass too many people about using it. Anyway, back onto build design. You should build in a way where you're covering a lot of bases. For me, I like to build into everything. Literally everything. I don't need a huge amount of physical resistance. I just need close to 30k. I'm close to 30k, I'm fine. That'll give me enough time to move away from a target and try and survive. Usually you don't always survive if a large group is focusing you. It's just not always possible. And with the game as snare heavy as it is, you have to take into account of recoveries as well. You should have higher health recovery and some respect, as well as high stam recovery, because sometimes heavy attacks don't always connect. Your vigors don't always go off, and when they do go off, you could be defiled, because some people run sets that cause defile. Or any dot can really actually reduce the amount of healing your vigor ticks do, as well as your rally. You have to take that into account. Not to mention, having mag recovery is important on certain classes like Stamsork, but it's not so vastly important because, I mean, Dark Deal doesn't cost a huge amount. And Crit Surge is pretty cheap as well, and Bolt Escape isn't too expensive if you're not using it too many times. And then there's the aspect of pools. You should have high pools, but you can't neglect the amount of damage that needs to be put into the build as a base form. You have to have high weapon damage, because max pools and weapon damage, or max pools and spell damage, average out in the end. Not to mention, you should try and build into crit as well. Crit is extremely important, because if you don't have crit, your healing by partisan is still going to be less than anyone else's, because you're not critting enough. If you're not critting enough, you're not healing enough. And most of the times, in conjunction with my builds, when I hit a pot, my health recovery is hitting almost 1,000 on this build when I'm not using Arteum Takeaway Broth. And that's another thing. Building into health recovery is vastly more important than just trying to build into physical resistance and relying on that alone. As well as conjunction as building into reasonable amount of physical resistance with a reasonable amount of weapon damage. You only need about 4,300 weapon damage to heal effectively in conjunction with health recovery. If you have low health recovery, you can't really support yourself with your vigors alone. That's why so many people build so heavily into damage now to try and get their vigors to tick so high. That's why hulking Fury and Bloodspawn, or Hulking, Fury, and Choking combinations are so good because health recovery is extremely powerful. That's why Artaeum Takeaway Broth is so expensive to use, and why Powdered Mother of Pearls are not easy to find. Zos knows this. That's why they're not giving you that so easily, and it makes me extremely angry that they know that, and it makes me extremely angry that I know that, because that's why it's so expensive to actually purchase, and it's very hard to get. Health recovery is one of the most powerful things in this game currently, and if you neglect it, you're missing out on a lot, especially from a Stamsork perspective. Especially if you play an Orc Stamsork. It's not applicable to have low damage on a class that has no buffs to healing, because Stamsork literally has no buffs to healing. I'm using Stamsork as an example specifically. Next, I want to talk about skills and passives, because those are equally as important when it comes to build design. They are part of the build, so they're part of the class, so they are equally important in build design. Skills and passives by Partisan can increase the amount of damage, the amount of healing, the amount of sustain, or just improve the overall stats as a whole. Those have to be taken into account when it comes to build design. If you're lacking certain skills like the Undaunted passives, you're going to be missing some healing, you're going to be missing some damage, and you're going to be missing some mitigation, of course, from your health. And you're going to be missing some magicka. So that has to be taken into account too. Now, if you're a Nightblade, you have certain skills in your kit that give you more resistances, depending on what skills you use, or mitigations, as well as healing. You have to, most of them use, I want to say, Siphoning Strikes. Most of them use Siphoning Strikes. When they kill something, they get resources back and they heal. A Stamsork has something like Bound Armaments that gives them increased health recovery, max health, and stam recovery, as well as improving max pools, just built into their passives alone. DK has stuff built into its passives just by maintaining Dragon Draconic Power abilities. It increases their healing by a specific amount. Those are some of the most important things when it comes into build design. You have to take that into account, but at the same time, you can't focus just on stats alone. When it comes to survivability, each class has something to help them survive. Take that into account more than anything. Bolt Escape is probably the number one thing a Stamsork should use on their class, or any Magsork can use on their class, specifically because it can save your life and get you out of hairy situations if you're trying to break line of sight and move away from multiple targets that are trying to kill you. You have to focus on, you can't just focus on the build alone. You have to focus on skills and techniques. That's also important, imperative to build design. If you're a DK, you kind of have to focus on building into what you already have, or giving yourself something that is effective. We're not looking for gimmicks here. You have to build into survivability if you want to win. Because if you're not building into survivability, you're going to have a terrible time playing DK. That's why I built mine for so much survivability and so much healing power. Now, also another thing, champion points. You have to take into the fact that champion points dictate pretty much however the fight is going to go, if the builds or if the classes are different. If you're a Dragon Knight fighting Templars or Magsorks, it's going to be an uphill battle no matter what, unless you're built to fight them. A majority of the time, most people are fighting at lower CP, which I am at now. I can deal pretty okay damage against someone who's 810 if they're not extremely tanky, or if their build isn't all well together, or if they're missing certain stats. But at the same time, when you're fighting someone competent and know what they're doing just as well as you are, CP will be a good determining factor. Specifically, if you're missing anything out of this tree, I'm only 430 CP right now on EU. I'm on EU, I'm 810 on, well, I'm like almost 1000 CP on NA. Here, I only have points in the thick skinned, and I'm making up for it right now because I have a lot of physical resistance. I didn't put anything else into any hardy or elemental defender. I'm telling you right ahead, I'm getting hit 30 to 40% harder by Dawnbreakers just because I'm lower CP than most people. I'm getting hit by abilities, let's say the Templar spammable, I can't remember the name of it right now. That's hitting me for an extra 20% just because I don't have these abilities. I'm getting hit by so many abilities way harder in a CP situation than I would in a non-CP situation. It's just the fact that you're missing so much mitigation here. You can't expect to fight people at a high level with only your resistances because you're missing CP. Even if you put something here, you're going to lack somewhere else. If you take points out of Ironclad, put them here, you're still missing all kinds of mitigation from Ironclad because it negates all types of direct damage, but it doesn't negate any damage over time. You're missing physical resistances if you take some out of here, and you're missing some out of crit resistance. Crit resistance is probably by far one of the most important ones, just because it reduces the amount of critical damage done to you, yourself. So, taking these into account, you have to have certain abilities to help support your build. If you're lacking in any source of resistances, or if you're lacking in recoveries, or if you're lacking in even, well, healing reduction is, you kind of don't even need this. Don't ignore that. I'm sorry if that disgusts you. It's okay. I understand. Like if you're not built for improving the amount of healing that you have, it's also going to affect your build and how well it works. Not to mention the amount of damage. I'm not going to do an extreme amount of damage to someone who's max CP, specifically because I don't have all of this maxed out. If you're not, I'm going to say this again, if you're not maximum CP, do not expect to do the maximum amount of damage output a max CP player would do to another max CP player. You're not on an even playing field. I have to remind this to myself at times. My Downbreaker only did like 2.5k. It would usually do like 4 or 5. You're not max CP, so it's not going to help you in most situations. Remember that. Especially now, since a lot of people build to be more tankier. You have to take those sort of things into account. Most people don't understand that. You try to build for what you see, and you try to make it unique, but at the same time, you have to understand if you're not at max level, it's not going to help you. That's about it. That's all I had to talk about. I want to say thanks again for watching. I'll probably be doing more commentaries in the future. Please like and subscribe. See you later.